Hello everyone, this is Space Café Podcast and I am Marcus. If you had a great idea, for example, for mining space resources on Mars or something similar, where would you file a patent? In the USA, in China, or Europe? Well, Europe, it isn't. It seems in Europe you pay to keep the processing of your application alive for years or decades, and that is, in the eyes of one analyst, just a tiny pebble in the big gear of a faltering European space presence. Europe on the sidelines of the global space race for new space? Well, we'll see in a moment, and we won't pick on ESA, promised, because ESA has a clear mandate. Well, doesn't it? Where does Europe stand in the global space discourse? I have Paul Taylor with me in the studio today.
Okay, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Can you hear me clearly?
Journalist, author, and space analyst. And he has, as the monthly magazine Politico writes, covered the main events in European integration and the main crises and knows where the bodies are buried.
You know, my bit is really the scary bit, because it's not about all the exciting adventures and gee whiz and how great things are going in space. It's about how there are disasters waiting to happen, how Europe is falling behind, and how we need to get real about the strategic implications of space.
Welcome, Paul Taylor, to our little cozy cafe.
So my name's Paul Taylor. I'm a journalist by training and a historian. I worked for almost 4 decades for Reuters, the international news agency. And since I hung up my pen for them, I've been writing a column called Europe at Large for Politico. And I've been writing reports for a think tank, Friends of Europe, about the different security challenges facing Europe, the European Union, its member states, and other countries in Europe. And in my 10th report, I've written about European security in space and the challenges that are facing the Europeans in space, which I think are multiple.
So who is your typical customer? Who reads your reports?
My reports are read by people in the military and defense community, by people in the European policy community and the policy communities in national politics and defense and security sector, in other think tanks, in the media. And I hope I write them accessibly enough that members of the general public can read them. Although I wouldn't recommend them as bedside reading unless you want to drop off to sleep pretty quickly.
So why is that? Because I guess not because it's boring, but it, as you already mentioned, it could potentially be a little bit frustrating to hear what is going on in space on a global scale at the moment and where Europe stands. So what's the problem at the moment?
Well, so it's absolutely not boring, but it's scary. It's scary in 3 dimensions, I think. One dimension is the potential for a disaster in low Earth orbit, where we see very clearly an accumulation of space junk, of space debris. And we continue to have an essentially unregulated space there, where despite the Outer Space Treaty with its great intentions, there's no actual authority that decides who can launch what, when, or where. There are no allocated parking spaces in low Earth orbit, unlike the geostationary orbit, where the International Telegraphic Union can actually assign slots, essentially, by controlling the frequencies. In low Earth orbit, it's a free-for-all. What we have is the law of the jungle, if you like, or the the Wild West, where the two laws.
The fun thing is, my toy drone, I'm not allowed to fly above, 40 meters. But the space above that you're saying is pretty much unregulated. I mean, like, we're not talking about 40 meters, but beyond the airliner space.
Exactly. Beyond the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Essentially is essentially an unregulated space in the sense there's no international regulation. Mm-hmm. So there's no IATA, if you imagine, that where air traffic control as being an analogy, where, there are clear rules for who can fly where and who gives the authority and the testing of the airworthiness of aircraft and all of that. All of that is regulated internationally. As far as low Earth orbit is concerned, the only authorities that regulate that at all are national authorities. But there's no international body that says who can launch how many satellites or into what orbits, and so on. So essentially, we have a situation a bit like the Wild West in the 19th century, where the only two laws that apply seem to be first come, first served, and finders keepers. Now, finders keepers is a dodgy law if you look at the Outer Space Treaty, which says that nobody can appropriate a space or celestial bodies. So you'd think that would mean that nobody could own a part of the moon or a part of a meteorite. But in fact, the United States and Luxembourg have both passed national legislation that say that you can keep what you dig up on a meteorite or on the moon.
Based on national legislation. I mean, like, for the Americans, we're used to them thinking that national legislation applies to the universe. But Luxembourg now takes that as a role model for themselves.
Well, yes, because they are one of the European countries that has a big civilian new space sector. And is specializing in space resources. And so they see a national advantage there, a competitive advantage, in passing that legislation. But there is no legislation on space resources at a European level collectively. So, each country, or some countries have their national space laws, others don't. And a lot of these things may lead to conflicts, may lead to difficult situations. The same thing with the question of, who lands on the moon first? And if they land there, are they entitled to declare essentially an exclusion zone? Under the Artemis Accords, which the United States has signed with a number of countries that want to join the Artemis probes to send man back to the moon by the middle of this decade and establish a permanent base on the moon, there is this notion that, of a security zone where there's an assumption that if any other craft approaches within that area, within a certain radius of where the U.S. probe is settled, then that will be regarded as a hostile approach. Right.
Is there anything we can learn? Because you were already referencing history. Is there anything we can learn from history? I mean, like, maybe we could take a look at the Oklahoma land rush, maybe back in, I don't know when that was, 1800. So how was that predicament resolved, the Wild West? How did the Wild West turn into the Mild West,
eventually, it was recognized that you needed the rule of law, that the rule of the gun was not going to be enough, that people could not run businesses if there was no certainty as to who owned what and who was entitled to what title of land and things like that. And that's what established the rule of law. It would be great if we could anticipate that in space, but we're already beyond that. We already have a situation, for example, where a single company owned and controlled by a single man, Elon Musk, is operating more than half of all the active satellites in low Earth orbit. I mean, it's unbelievable. And who is regulating that? Well, the United States is regulating that. But what incentive, what interest does the United States have in limiting Elon Musk's access to space, given that he's also providing vital services for NASA, the U.S. Space Agency, and for the Pentagon, for the U.S. Defense Department. And he's making his money primarily off the contracts that he makes with the defense sector, and then using that to support his business model for spreading internet broadband. So there are lots of issues that this raises. These are issues of law, but it's one of those spaces where technology has got ahead of regulation, a bit like cyberspace, if you like, or the metaverse, where we have technological development that make things possible that weren't imagined when the Outer Space Treaty was signed. It was signed for essentially there were two superpowers, and the only people active in space were states. Now we have the private sector that has more satellites in space than states do. We have not 2 states, but 53 states when I last checked, active in space. And we have a whole array of uses of space that are absolutely essential for our daily life, but where there is no adequate international regulation.
Paul, who will we need to call now to fix this?
Well, the traditional answer would be the United Nations, because they are the international body, and they have 2 committees which are working at a very glacial pace on this issue, right? You've got the UN Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is working in Vienna and is looking at issues like space resources. And then you've got the UN Committee on Disarmament, which is working in Geneva on issues of arms control. But both of these UN bodies, because of their universal nature and because of the current geopolitical situation, are essentially paralyzed. They're unable to come to agreements, whether legally binding or even politically binding agreements on a lot of these issues. So it may be better for countries that are, let's say, like-minded, Western countries, but not only Western. But I think of countries like the European Union countries, the UK, the United States and Canada, other countries that are involved in space, such as Japan, South Korea. Why not India? Why not Brazil? And try and get those countries. The United Arab Emirates would be another one. Why try and get those countries around a table to come up with some guidelines. Now, the United States doesn't like treaties anymore because they're so difficult to get Congress to ratify. So the Americans prefer sort of politically binding codes of conduct, guidelines for good behavior in space. But at least to try and get some agreements among most countries. And the Russians and the Chinese may go their own way. They have their own increasing space cooperation. They put forward a treaty at the UN Conference on Disarmament a few years ago that is meant to outlaw weapons in outer space. The problem with that is it wouldn't outlaw the use of weapons from Earth to hit satellites, which is precisely what they have been demonstrating their
India
capability
and Russia,
to
yes.
do.
Yeah.
Causing, as we know, a great deal of space junk. Yeah. So I would suggest probably the like-minded approach is the best. Okay. On the European level, the European Union is probably the best place to start because it's 27 countries. It's a pity, of course, that it no longer includes the UK. But and from there, one could move to groups of like-minded countries. The question for me is partly, how far will the United States be willing to go in this kind of regulation? Because you could say, if you were sitting in Washington, well, we have first mover advantage.
Sure.
It's not in our interest to restrain the launches by SpaceX and Blue Origin and so on, because we can get up there and occupy that space before everybody else. The counter argument is that the United States, precisely because it is the biggest user, both commercially and militarily, of outer space, stands to lose the most if the Kessler syndrome were to come about. That's to say, if we got a chain reaction of space collisions due to pieces of debris, dead satellites, meteorites, and so on, and then they would only have their eyes to cry with.
All right, that's a good way to start a conversation. So we have.
I told you, I do the scary bits of space.
So that's the fun part, number one. Now, number two, not so good news for Europe. You discovered by your research in your report that Europe has fallen behind in some areas of the space race.
Yeah, I mean,
so? How dramatic is the situation?
Well, first of all, let's say that Europe has some great assets that make it a serious player in space. I don't know whether it's number 3, number 4, or number 5, but it's a serious player in space because it has the Galileo satellite navigation and positioning system. It has the Copernicus Earth observation network. It has the Ariane and Vega launchers. It has the Kourou spaceport. It has the EU Satellite Center in Spain, which analyzes satellite imagery and satellite data for member state governments. And it has a great science base, and it has pockets of real excellence in the new space sector, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in the UK. So Europe has a lot of assets in space, but it has to be said, it's fallen behind in some of the key areas which may determine prosperity over the coming years. So reusable and micro launchers, we're clearly behind in that. Only last week, SpaceX put up a rocket that launched a launcher on its 13th launch, reusable launcher that then landed on an autonomous pod in the ocean to
be. But that is incredible, isn't it?
It is incredible.
Yeah.
And we have nothing like it. And we have nothing like it on the horizon, to be honest. And in micro launchers, we haven't yet, we've got several companies working on them, but we haven't yet actually demonstrated the capability. Some countries that have leaders in this field don't seem to want to have a spaceport either on their territory or in the North Sea. So it's a question of where these things are going to be launched from if these companies do come good. Then there's satellite constellations. We have the UK is involved with Indian investors and so on in OneWeb, but the continental Europe still doesn't have any satellite constellations. And now the European Union, the European Commission has a proposal to do one for secure connectivity, but it's not yet clear whether member states will support it, either because they're suspicious about each other's motives, commercial and political, or because the richer companies don't want to pay for it because they think it's subsidizing others.
So what is... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of other areas where we're seriously behind, I would say, are space situational awareness. I mean, let's be honest. For most European countries, the only way we know if some piece of junk or some dud satellite is about to hit our satellite is if the Americans tell us, if the U.S. Defense Department tells us. We don't have eyes that are able to see what's going on in space. And to me, that's an absolute basic. We have very limited capabilities. We have some capabilities, Earth-based. There are attempts being made to network those, but we're really short in the area of space situational awareness, what the military calls space domain awareness, and being able to see what's...
Just out of curiosity, is it that we know from the Americans what is going on up there because the Americans talk openly about it? Or is it that only the Americans have the gear? I mean, would the Russians know if something happens up there? The Indians?
I assume that the Russians have a substantial space situational awareness capability, but I don't know that much about it. And I assume that the Chinese are also developing it. I don't think the Indians have a very large space. I think the thing is that the United States has for decades actually provided this as a public service.
Sure.
Because it's in America's interest too, that there shouldn't be lots of collisions in space.
Sure.
So, as a public service, the U.S., it was done by NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. Now it's been, during the Trump administration, it was put under the U.S. Department of Commerce. Some people interpreted that as a possible prelude to try to make foreign countries or pay for the service, or perhaps even for privatizing it. That hasn't happened so far. But the question is, how long can Europe afford to go on not being able to see what's going on in space and not having the full picture? So, and how can Europe pretend to do space traffic management if it can't see the traffic? So that's, I think, a priority for Europe, and it's one of the areas that has been identified by the European Commission and by ESA as something that we need to improve. So those are the things. And then I think the other thing I would say is that the overwhelming reason why we've fallen behind is the dearth of public investment compared to the United States and China in space. Europe, if you want to put a very favorable gloss on it, is spending about 8 billion euro a year. If you combine what the EU, ESA, and national budgets are spending. The United States is spending $55 billion a year, and it has been doing essentially at that level every year since the 1960s.
And if you compare that to annual revenue gains in big pharma, for example, you have 20 billion, one company only. I mean, just to bring that into perspective, or the overall budget of Stanford University, Harvard University. I mean, this brings into perspective where we talk about 20 billion, 30 billion dollars a year. And now let's put that into perspective with the 8 billion you were just mentioning for the entire European space strategy. I mean, that speaks a very clear language.
Well, I agree with you. I know. I mean, when I make this point in my think tank, people ask me a very sensible question, which is, how do we persuade taxpayers at the moment when they've got the aftermath of COVID, hopefully the aftermath of COVID, when we've got the war in Ukraine and inflation and energy prices going up, when we've got growing disparities between rich and poor in our societies? How do we persuade the public to spend more taxpayer money on space? And the answer to that, I think, is partly in what we see in Ukraine. That's to say, the way in which space directly affects the security of our continent. But it's also partly in the fact that space has so many uses that we take for granted. For our communications, for television, for monitoring of climate change, for observing crop patterns, for water patterns, all of these things which are vital on Earth. And therefore, spending money on space can be and should be a multiplier of our prosperity, of our security, and of our environmental protection. I mean, if we do it right.
If we bring that into perspective, if we turned off our satellites in orbit right now, first of all, we wouldn't be able to talk with one another at the moment. Then there's no ATM machines. Then there's no traffic management. Then there's no traffic lights. Then there's no water management. Then there's no television. So that's not just a nice to have thing. Right. We already mentioned in an earlier episode that space is not out there. Space is part of our reality as humanity. So we have moved into the third dimension. We've evolved into the third dimension with space technology. So this is not something some rich folks or scientists would love to have and would love to play with. This is our everyday life. And I'd be curious to find out how people react when you're bringing up such examples?
I think in the strategic community, in the defense community, there's an awareness. I would say with politicians, there's an interest. I think that the military commanders and maybe the industrialists are ahead of where the politicians are in terms of their awareness of the importance of space and the competitive nature of space. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to think about clever ways to get this across to our politicians. Mm-hmm. In France, where I live, the French armed forces have run two really important space defense exercises called Asterix, after the plucky little Gaul. Yeah. And they got not only policymakers from the Ministry of Defense, but they also got politicians from the Parliamentary Defense Committee and so on to come along and see these exercises so that they could get an understanding of the threats that we face in space, the different kinds of ways in which our space assets are endangered, at risk, both the risks, the accidental risks from space debris and so on, but also the deliberate risks from anti-satellite attacks, from dazzling, from spoofing, from blinding, from jamming, from cyber attacks, all of these different potential ways in which an adversary could blind us, could attack a particular or take out a particular satellite that would switch off the water systems or the public transport systems of a large city in the West somewhere. And therefore, that begins to build the understanding of the need to protect these systems. And how we protect these systems is that Europe needs to get real about space defense. And I think there, the awareness is very variable. I think it's quite high in France. It's rising in the UK. It's also, I think, rising in Italy, which has got a serious space defense sector and a policy. But it's still very much under the rug in Germany, and the German Defense Ministry has adopted some guidelines for space defense, but they haven't been made public. It shouldn't be aired before the children.
To me, all this sounds reasonable, but at the same time scary, because it seems like we're all gearing up for conflict wherever we look. So the Italians, the French, the British, we're gearing up and putting energy and effort into defending our assets, defending something. Whenever I go online these days, in my newsfeed, I observe a very high number of posts related to newest defense gear. So I'm not at all interested in military technology, but I keep being informed with that kind of information. So at the moment, it seems kind of scary. At the same time, it's all war and conflict directed. But
Mark, the situation is scary.
Yeah.
Because these capabilities exist. I'm not making this stuff up.
Yeah.
There are other powers who've tested and demonstrated all sorts of counter space capabilities. And in fact, Europe is probably the only continent where we haven't worked on so far counter space capabilities. And the French are just beginning to start to think about, do they need a counter space deterrent? But they're being quite clear that it mustn't create space debris. But they're looking at things like possibly laser weapons. But a lot of this is not about attacking other people's systems, but about protecting our own. If we are convinced that the systems we have in space are vital to the functioning of our society and of our economy, and if we are convinced that if we know for a fact that other countries are developing and investing in capabilities to attack, interfere with, and so on. And if we can see examples every few weeks of these capabilities being used in one way or another, of a dazzler being used to dazzle a satellite, of a cyber attack that takes out, for example, just look at what happened in the Ukraine conflict. On the very first day of the Ukraine conflict, Russian hackers took out the downlink from the Viasat satellites to terminals all over Europe, and specifically in Ukraine, where they were being used by the defense ministry to maintain the connections between headquarters and units in the field. So this was a way of trying to blind Ukraine on the first day of the war. We've seen another very important use of satellite technology in this and space in this war. For the first time, we've seen a massive, you could call it a democratization of space imagery. You know, the public for a few $1,000s, you can buy space imagery from a commercial company that is almost of the quality that the military have. So that removes a lot of the secrecy around military maneuvers. And it deprived Russia of the element of strategic surprise in their attack on Ukraine, because for months people could observe, not just states who could do that with their own secret equipment, but through the use of companies like Maxar, Planet, people could see
where
this
troops were,
Russian military buildup. Right. So, and again, another use of space. So when the Viasat terminals were taken down, Elon Musk came in with SpaceX and said, I'll provide you, I will donate to you terminals so that you can get things up and running again. You can have broadband internet and you can have your connections with your header. And so very quickly, they used these terminals to connect the drones that are there to do the spotting with the artillery firing systems. And they were able to take out columns of Russian tanks thanks to this improvised connection. Not only that, but also it's because of that space, that use of commercial sector space, that we're able to see what's going on in Mariupol, that we're able to see those images of the atrocities that went on in Bucha and around Kiev, that we're able to see every day what's happening in the war, that President Zelensky is able to continue broadcasting every night to his people, even though Russia has staged missile attacks to take out the television towers. So you can see how important space has been in that conflict. And I think that shows that, you know, we have to be realistic. We have to be prepared to make our space systems more robust. Now, there are various ways you can do it. Let's talk about protection rather than defending or attacking. How do we better protect our space assets? Well, we can make them more maneuverable. We can make them harder to attack, for example, by surrounding our key, really important communications or military satellites with constellations of microsatellites that make it harder to come closer to. We can also, you know, there are lots of passive ways, as it were, in which we can protect our systems. We can find ways of refueling satellites that will enable us to prolong their lives and make them able to maneuver without losing life expectancy because of the energy that's involved in doing the maneuvers. There are all sorts of ways we can do it. We can be clever about frequencies. We can be clever about all sorts of things. And I'm no technical expert in this. But the question that arises is, do we need some kind of space deterrent of our own? Is it enough just to say, if you attack my satellite, I'll move it out of the way? Or do we have to be able to say, if you attack our satellite, then I have some way of getting back at you? Not necessarily in space. Now, NATO has actually already done that because NATO declared a couple of years ago that an attack in space could be grounds to invoke Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause. That doesn't mean you attack me in space and I'll attack you in space. What it means is you attack me in space and I will retaliate if I choose, in whatever domain I choose to do it. So we need to find ways of developing deterrence. Now, the question is, does deterrence work in space? Because, the thing about if I attack your satellite, there are no casualties. It's not like if I attack the Twin Towers in New York and 3,000 people are dead. So that raises the question, will our political leaders be willing, because of an attack on a satellite, to essentially declare war or to declare a mutual defense, Verteidigungsfall, as you call it in Germany, the need to go to defense.
What is ESA's role in all of this?
Well, ESA is obviously not involved in the military side. ESA is a purely civilian agency. It's important because it has the technological know-how, because it knows how to put programs together. It knows how to evaluate technology, and therefore ESA is really important in putting together the programs that we have, both scientific and Earth observation and so on. But ESA, by its statutes, is not going to be involved in the military side of this. There needs to be a division of labor. Well, I think you need a division of labor. I don't think that's ESA's role. We will never have a single European space agency that does everything, because Europe is complicated. So in ESA, we have important countries like the United Kingdom, but also Switzerland and Norway, which are not members of the European Union. And in the European Union, we have a number of countries that are not members of ESA. So for all those reasons, we will continue to go along with two different bodies at least involved. I think we need a sort of three-way division of labor, where ESA does the science and the technological enabling. The European Union, the European Commission, and its agencies run the programs and provide, as it were, the enablers for member states. And I think that the European Union could do that in partnership with NATO, because NATO actually has no space assets of its own at all. NATO doesn't have a Galileo. It doesn't have a Copernicus. So NATO needs eyes in space. It relies on its own member nations for all the space data which it needs for the space observation, for the space communications. So I think there's a possibility there for a partnership between the EU and NATO. And then I think that what I was talking about, some kind of space deterrent, will probably have to be done by individual member states, because I don't see the EU collectively agreeing to develop a space weapon. So I think it will either be done by an individual nation such as France, which has nuclear weapons, or the UK, or it might be done by a small coalition of countries. So it might be France and Germany, or France and Italy, or a combination of the three. If they can build fighter planes together, why not? Why not some sort of counter space capability?
I'm still wondering, and I would like to curve back to ESA. When you were mentioning that Europe has allegedly fallen behind in the space race, and Europe should get real about space as a strategic domain. I'm asking myself, has ESA failed so far in some respects? I mean, like, this is our strongest body in Europe when it comes to space. And ESA has been equipped with its largest budget in the a couple of 3 years ago. Now, I'm wondering, has the directorate failed?
So I don't think ESA has failed. And I think Josef Aschbacher would be the first person to acknowledge, and he did when I launched my report. He gave a keynote speech at the Friends of Europe Making Space Matter Summit that day. on June the 20th, where he acknowledged very bluntly where Europe is falling behind. And he acknowledges that it's largely a result of a long-term shortfall in public investment compared to the United States and China. He has a plan. He has his Agenda 2025. Now, for years, it's true to say that the relationship between ESA and the EU has been tense at times. They've not always cooperated very well. I see an improvement there. Both Commissioner Thierry Breton for the European Commission and Joseph Aschbacher are working very hard to make it work. I think they realize that the kind of petty rivalries, the differences that there have been over the years have not been good. What they need to do also is to overhaul the business environment for our new space sector, because the fact is, several of our problems are self-inflicted. It's not just that the governments are not investing enough money, but our bureaucratic tendering processes are too slow. Our patent registration is too slow. The other day, I had a space entrepreneur who I quote in the report, Alfredo Munoz, who has designed a city on Mars. He made applications 5 years ago for patents. 3 patents he applied for in the United States, the European Union, and China. After 5 years, he got 3 patents in the United States for roughly $1,500 each. He got 1 patent in China. He still has 0 patents in Europe. All he got was a single letter of acknowledgement of his application from the European Patent Office, and he has to pay them 1,500 euros every year just to keep his application on file.
Wow.
So that's an example of where we're tying ourselves in knots. The difficulty of access to venture capital is another example. Now here, the European Commission is trying to improve that with this new Cassini program. Too early to tell how that's going to work. There are other things. ESA has the principle of geographical distribution among the member states of the workload, of the work share. This is very typical of what goes wrong in Europe, also in the defense sector, where you spread out the work, not where it's economically efficient, but you do it so that everybody gets a fair return from their investment. And also ESA had the objective, a laudable objective, of developing the space sector in countries where there was a need to help. Countries, for example, such as Poland and the Czech Republic, which have done well as a result of this. But it's not necessarily economically efficient, and it doesn't make us very competitive with the American commercial sector, which is our main challenge.
Usually at the end of a report, there's a positive conclusion, a positive outlook. How do you conclude your report?
Well, I conclude my report with some recommendations. I don't think that the disaster in Leo has to happen. I think it can be averted. I don't think that Europe is doomed to fall further and further behind in space. I think if we get our act together in the ways that I've recommended, then we still have a really major benefits in space and a serious place. I think we need to get real about space defense, and I thought that before the war began in Ukraine. But the fact is, we now see the reality of major interstate war on our continent, which you and I, Marcus, as children of the post-World War II era, hoped and believed we would never see. And that changes a lot of things, and it's got to change our mindset as well. So I hope that that's a positive message. We can avoid disasters, but we shouldn't ignore them. And that goes for the disaster, that goes for the dangers in Leo. It goes for the need not to ignore where we're falling behind in space. And it goes for the need to get real about defense in space.
Usually at the end of our show, I'm asking that Space Café inspiration question. I think that was already the answer to it. So for my kids, of course, I'm reading bedtime stories to my kids. Where do I get your report?
I will send you the URL. You can find it online on the website of friendsofeurope.org, www.friendsofeurope.org. And I will send you the URL so that for your kids, in your blurb on the Space Café, you can include the URL for listeners to click on.
Right.
And read to their children at night if they want to scare them.
Exactly. Don't watch Stranger Things. Read that report. That's scary enough.
Or as they say, don't look up.
Yeah, exactly. Paul, what is your favorite space-related piece of music? Because I'm building up a Space Café podcast music library on Spotify. So I'm asking my guests for a tune they would recommend.
I have to say, and I'm sure I won't be the first person to say so, but it's showing my age. You know, when I was a teenager, the big or just out of teens probably, the Ground Control to Major Tom.
All right, you got it. So you're the first one with Major Tom, so that one is already taken by you.
But I think also, again, I'm a child of Stanley Kubrick's film, and the music, Also sprach Zarathustra.
Yeah.
I promise. I hope you won't broadcast me singing.
No. All good. But that is a brilliant piece of.
It's a brilliant film, and it was so far ahead of its time.
Yeah,
and it's a great piece of music.
And the fun thing is, it still is. I mean, like that movie came out in '69, and it still seems like a modern movie to me.
Absolutely. And I remember going to see it in '69. And
in '69, you did.
Well, I was 15 at the time. And
you know what? I heard it got really bad reviews in the first year.
I don't know. Certainly among us kids, it was a cult film. I saw it twice.
Wow.
And I remember my American cousin coming to stay with me in Newcastle in the north of England, where I was brought up. And we watched live on television the moon landing. And being naughty teenage children, we were speculating about what the appropriate obscene gesture the astronauts might make to Earth.
Of course they didn't. What time of day was that?
One finger for mankind.
What time of day was that? The moon landing over here in Europe.
It was sort of quite late in the evening in England. It was I sort of after 9 o'clock. You know, it was.
So you were allowed to stay up late.
I was allowed to stay up, and I had very strict parents who didn't allow us to watch much television as children.
But for a moon landing was okay.
And I watched it in black and white.
Because it was in black and white, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, it was in black and white. And of course, we didn't have a color set at that time either.
Wonderful, Paul Taylor. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Marcus. Alles Gute.
Alles Gute, Paul. Thank you for sticking around with us today. You know what? It's episode 60, and we are climbing up the podcast charts. It's pretty cool to see our little Space Café gain ever more presence, not least thanks to your presence in all this. If you can spare 20 seconds now, right after this, please consider heading over to iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate the Space Café podcast. As always, it is the only language the internet understands, and we would love to become the prime destination for space content. So, 20 seconds tops. Deal? Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.